What you are about to read never flashed across the primetime evening newscasts. It never ignited a viral storm across the major social media platforms. It never received the relentless wall-to-wall media saturation that an event of this magnitude should have commanded in a healthy democracy. Yet it unfolded, unmistakably and indelibly, inside a formal United States House of Representatives committee hearing room, captured on the official record for anyone willing to look, spoken in plain English under the bright lights and the watchful eyes of cameras and stenographers. A sitting member of Congress, a congresswoman representing the people of Texas, rose to her feet, fixed her gaze directly on the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and delivered a verdict that was not whispered, not hinted at, not softened with diplomatic cushioning, but stated with unmistakable force. He was, in her precise words, the least qualified FBI director in the history of the FBI. And she did not stop there. She did not leave the accusation hanging in the air as mere rhetoric. She supported it, methodically and relentlessly, point by documented point, fact by verifiable fact, laying out a case that built like a gathering storm until the emotion at its climax landed with the weight of a detonation. You hold the power to stop reading right now. You can click away, return to the carefully curated highlight reels, the polished talking head commentary, and the familiar partisan framing that dominates most coverage of Washington proceedings. That choice belongs entirely to you, and there is no judgment attached to it whatsoever. Many people prefer the comfort of those sanitized versions. They serve a purpose for those who want the noise without the signal. But if you are someone who hungers for the unfiltered reality of what actually transpired in that hearing room, the raw, unscripted language, the concrete evidence formally submitted into the congressional record, and the raw surge of emotion that crackled at the very end like an electrical discharge, then remain right here. We are going to dissect every layer of it together, step by step, moment by moment, without omission or embellishment beyond what the record itself supports. This is not framed as a simple left versus right clash, though the players occupy positions on that spectrum. Instead, this is a deeper story about something far more fundamental: accountability in the institutions that are supposed to serve all Americans, the integrity of those institutions when they come under intense political pressure, and the single haunting question that ought to disturb the sleep of every citizen regardless of party affiliation, ideology, or background. Is the FBI, the nation's premier federal law enforcement agency, truly fulfilling its sworn duty to protect the public, or has it been redirected, subtly or overtly, to serve the priorities of someone else? The stakes could not be higher, and the implications stretch into every corner of American life. Let us walk through it all, carefully and thoroughly, beginning with the essential context that makes every subsequent moment intelligible. To understand the weight of what occurred, one must first appreciate how the Federal Bureau of Investigation came to be led by this particular director at this particular moment in history. Kash Patel, referred to in the proceedings and in public discourse sometimes with slight variations in pronunciation but consistently identified as the individual in question, was not a career agent who had spent decades rising through the ranks of the Bureau, learning its culture, mastering its procedures, and earning the trust of its rank-and-file personnel from the inside. No, his path to the top job was different. He was selected and appointed by President Donald Trump to head the agency. Presidential appointments to critical posts are, of course, a long-standing feature of the American constitutional system. Every administration, regardless of party, installs loyalists or trusted allies in positions of power. That is how the executive branch functions and how policy priorities are translated into action. Yet the circumstances surrounding Patel's appointment carried unique dimensions that the congresswoman from Texas seized upon immediately as she began her remarks. She did not open with fiery indignation or theatrical outrage. Instead, she began with cold, hard facts, delivered in a measured tone that only grew sharper as she progressed, like a blade being drawn slowly across stone. Her first, foundational observation was stark and historically unprecedented. Kash Patel is the only director in the entire history of the FBI who had never before served a single day inside the Bureau in any capacity prior to assuming the role of its leader. Pause and absorb the full implication of that statement. For more than a century, from the earliest days of the organization through every major evolution of its mission, through world wars, Cold War espionage battles, the fight against organized crime, the post-9/11 reorganization, and the modern era of counterterrorism and cyber threats, every single previous director had possessed some form of direct, hands-on experience within the institution itself. They had walked the halls as agents, supervised field offices, managed complex investigations, or at minimum held senior leadership positions that immersed them in the Bureau's operational DNA. That foundational familiarity was not a mere formality. It was the bedrock that allowed them to understand the agency's strengths, its weaknesses, its internal culture, the delicate balance between aggressive law enforcement and the protection of civil liberties, and the quiet, day-to-day realities that determine whether the FBI can actually deliver on its mandate. Patel arrived with none of that. Zero institutional memory. Zero operational seasoning at the street level or the headquarters level. And yet, the Congresswoman noted with a cutting edge in her voice that sharpened the air in the room, the public and the Senate were expected to accept this break from precedent as the greatest thing since sliced bread. A dismissive phrase delivered not as genuine praise but as biting sarcasm, underscoring what she saw as an unwarranted celebration of inexperience at the helm of the most powerful law enforcement agency on the planet. She was only warming up. Before Patel's confirmation had even been finalized, troubling indicators had already begun to surface, according to the detailed account the Congresswoman laid out and corroborated by statements from her colleague representing Georgia. These were not vague rumors or partisan whispers. They were specific allegations of actions taken or prepared that targeted long-time career professionals inside the Bureau. These were not entry-level employees or political appointees who could reasonably expect turnover with a new administration. These were veteran agents, analysts, and supervisors whose careers had been built on the promise of insulation from partisan winds. They were the kind of personnel the system is designed to protect precisely so they can pursue cases based on evidence and law, not on the occupant of the White House or the shifting tides of electoral politics. The cases drawing the most intense scrutiny, the ones generating the greatest internal friction, were those with direct ties to the president who had appointed Patel himself. Here the Congresswoman highlighted a structural tension that cannot be waved away as mere conspiracy thinking. When the individual chosen to lead an agency responsible for independent investigations is personally and politically intertwined with the very subject matter of those investigations, the appearance, and potentially the reality, of compromised impartiality becomes unavoidable. It is not about assuming malice. It is about acknowledging basic human incentives and institutional design flaws that become magnified when the guardrails of precedent and experience are removed. The room grew noticeably quieter as she pressed this point, the weight of the implications settling over the committee members, the witnesses, and the public gallery alike. Then came the moment that chilled the atmosphere even further, a statement delivered with the moral authority of lived experience rather than abstract rhetoric. The Congresswoman, speaking as a black woman who had witnessed the human cost of political violence firsthand, declared that she no longer knew who in this country could truly feel safe, except, she said, for white supremacists. Those were not casual or careless words flung into the ether for shock value. They were chosen deliberately, rooted in a pattern she had observed and documented. She spoke of colleagues, members of Congress, who had received credible death threats, not for partisan posturing but for performing the basic democratic act of casting a vote according to their conscience. She placed into the record multiple news articles detailing threats directed specifically at Republican lawmakers who had opposed Jim Jordan's bid for House Speaker. These were not Democratic targets, these were Republicans, fellow elected officials within the same party, whose families had been terrorized to the point that one lawmaker's wife was reportedly sleeping with a loaded firearm beside her bed out of raw fear for her safety and her children's safety. The Congresswoman looked straight at the FBI director and posed the direct, unflinching question: would the Bureau under his leadership have identified, pursued, and neutralized those threats? Would it have protected these individuals and their loved ones with the same vigor it claims to apply across the board? Based on the pattern she had outlined, she expressed profound doubt that the answer would be affirmative. The contrast was deliberate and devastating. An agency ostensibly dedicated to impartial justice appeared, in her view, to be selectively attentive depending on the political valence of the victims or the perpetrators. This channel has always prioritized evidence over manufactured outrage, and that commitment remains unchanged. So let us continue following the documented thread without deviation. If the kind of meticulous, unvarnished analysis that cuts through the daily fog of spin resonates with you, consider supporting it right now by liking this piece. It directly helps surface this level of detail to others who are equally weary of surface-level coverage. And if you have not yet subscribed, the option sits right there. The decision is yours alone. But whether you engage those buttons or not, the substance continues, because we are only approaching the midpoint of what unfolded, and the operational stakes are about to sharpen dramatically. The discussion then pivoted from the personal and political qualifications of the director to the concrete, day-to-day functioning of the Bureau itself, an area that should alarm every American citizen irrespective of where they stand on the ideological spectrum. The Congresswoman introduced a statistic that landed with almost audible impact. Patel had informed the Senate during his confirmation process that it would require a full 14 years for the FBI to reach full staffing levels. 14 years. Not 14 months, not a short-term surge plan, but a generational timeline to achieve the basic capacity needed to fulfill the core missions of preventing criminal activity and safeguarding national security. In the interim, while the agency operated well below optimal strength, the Congresswoman detailed how existing, already overburdened resources were being redirected in ways that strained the institution further. Agents were being pulled away from their specialized casework, investigations into violent crime, public corruption, cyber threats, and domestic extremism, and reassigned to perform what amounted to frontline immigration enforcement duties, functioning essentially as additional personnel on the streets for that specific priority. At the very same time, the Bureau was said to be accelerating the departure of some of its most seasoned, most knowledgeable veterans. The practical consequences are sobering when you unpack them layer by layer. An agency already operating with chronic understaffing is simultaneously losing institutional knowledge at an accelerated rate while repurposing its remaining personnel away from their primary expertise. The result is a hollowing effect: fewer eyes on the threats that have historically caused the greatest harm to ordinary citizens, slower response times, reduced depth of investigation, and an overall diminution of the protective shield the public has long taken for granted. How can Americans feel confident in their safety when the math simply does not add up? She bolstered this operational critique by citing a specific CNN report that had been formally submitted into the congressional record. According to sources within law enforcement quoted in that reporting, morale inside the Bureau had reached its lowest point in memory. The institution was becoming, in the words of those insiders, almost unrecognizable to the people who had devoted their careers to it. Seasoned agents and analysts were confronting agonizing personal and professional decisions, whether to remain and fight from within a changing culture or to seek stability elsewhere. This was not presented as abstract human resources concern, it was framed as a direct threat to public safety. A demoralized, distracted, and depleted FBI cannot maintain the vigilance required to intercept plots, solve complex cases, or deter those who would do harm. Institutional stress of this magnitude does not remain contained within the walls of the J. Edgar Hoover Building. It radiates outward into neighborhoods, courtrooms, airports, and financial systems across the country. The Congresswoman made clear that leaving this situation unaddressed would carry tangible, measurable costs for real families who rely on the FBI as a last line of defense. The hearing also confronted the persistent and evolving danger of foreign interference in American democratic processes. The Congresswoman entered into the record a series of authoritative documents from credible institutions, assessments from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, reporting from Politico, and official statements from the broader U.S. intelligence community. Together they painted a consistent and deeply troubling portrait. Russia, Iran, and China maintain active, sophisticated, and continuously adapting programs aimed at undermining the integrity of U.S. elections and eroding public confidence in the outcomes. Russia, in particular, was described as pursuing objectives that have remained remarkably stable across multiple election cycles, sowing division among Americans, amplifying existing domestic grievances, and exploiting social fault lines to weaken national cohesion. Increasingly, these efforts leverage artificial intelligence tools of growing sophistication, deepfakes, automated propaganda networks, targeted disinformation campaigns scaled to millions of users in real time. The Congresswoman also placed into the record documentation concerning Russia's Ghostwriter hacker group and its operations against elections in Germany, serving as explicit reminder that tactics tested and refined abroad are rarely confined there. They function instead as dress rehearsals for operations on American soil. The message was unmistakable: if foreign adversaries can successfully destabilize democratic processes elsewhere, they are almost certainly attempting the same here, and the FBI bears primary responsibility for detecting and disrupting those efforts on domestic soil. When the Bureau itself is grappling with internal turmoil, the question arises with renewed urgency: who exactly is guarding the perimeter? One of the most jarring and emotionally charged segments centered on the wave of threats directed at historically black colleges and universities, HBCUs. In the period following the events under discussion, campuses that serve as vital centers of education, culture, and community for black students experienced a surge in domestic terrorism, bomb threats, credible warnings of violence, entire student bodies suddenly forced to confront the possibility that their classrooms, dormitories, or chapels could become targets. The Congresswoman reported that, from her vantage point, the FBI under Patel's leadership had offered no visible public statement, no high-profile reassurance, no transparent update on investigative progress. She spoke directly to the lived experience of black Americans, asking, with understandable frustration and fear, how they had arrived at a moment where such institutions could feel so exposed. She pointed to the unambiguous statistical record, data drawn from the FBI's own prior assessments, that identifies racially motivated violent extremism, particularly white supremacist ideology, as one of the most significant and rapidly growing domestic threats facing the country. This is not partisan rhetoric, it is the Bureau's own historical reporting distilled into cold numbers, incidents, victims, trends, and patterns that have resulted in children killed, worshippers attacked in their churches, community members gunned down while simply going about their daily lives. The Congresswoman stated plainly that nothing she had heard from Director Patel during the hearing gave her any confidence that this threat matrix would receive the focused, aggressive attention it demands. The silence, in her view, spoke volumes. Further weight was added by a letter originating from within the FBI itself, formally submitted into the congressional record. This was not external criticism from activists or political opponents. It was a communication from active agents and personnel to members of Congress. The letter warned in explicit terms that the summary terminations, firings conducted without standard due process, currently underway would have the perverse effect of making the nation less safe. These actions, the agents wrote, distract personnel from their core missions, instill widespread fear that today's assignment or yesterday's case could become tomorrow's career-ending liability depending on the political climate, and erode the unity and morale essential for effective law enforcement. The result, they argued, is an increased vulnerability to both criminal enterprises and national security threats. Reading the language again underscores its gravity. This was a 5-alarm internal alert, written by the very people sworn to protect the country, stating that current leadership decisions were actively undermining that protection. Under ordinary circumstances, a document of this nature from inside the FBI would have dominated headlines, cable panels, and social media discourse for days. Instead, it required a dedicated congressional hearing and a detailed public breakdown to receive sustained attention. As the proceedings drew toward their conclusion, the atmosphere shifted once more, this time toward a concrete procedural action that altered the temperature in the room palpably. The Congresswoman formally moved, under the committee's established rules, to issue a subpoena to the head of the Bureau of Prisons, William K. Marshall. The subpoena sought his appearance before the committee along with the production of all records pertaining to the transfer of Ghislaine Maxwell, Jeffrey Epstein's convicted co-conspirator, a woman found guilty in federal court of child sex trafficking and related offenses, currently serving a substantial prison sentence. The motion alleged that Maxwell had been moved to a minimum security prison camp in a manner that appeared to violate standard Bureau of Prisons policies governing the housing of sex offenders. This transfer, according to the motion, followed an interview Maxwell had conducted with Todd Blanche, who at the time served as President Trump's personal attorney and who now holds the position of Deputy Attorney General. The chain of custody and decision-making implied by that sequence raised profound questions. A convicted participant in one of the most notorious sex trafficking cases in modern American history receiving what appeared to be preferential treatment, placement in lower security conditions reserved for far less dangerous inmates, after contact with a senior official now embedded in the Department of Justice. The motion demanded full production of communications between the Bureau of Prisons, the Department of Justice, the FBI, and the White House related to the transfer. This was no peripheral procedural footnote. If the underlying allegations hold, and the committee's decision to pursue the subpoena indicated they believed sufficient basis existed, it strikes at the heart of equal justice under law. It forces examination of whether certain individuals, by virtue of their connections or the sensitivity of the information they possess, receive treatment unavailable to ordinary citizens. It also raises the unavoidable question of whether the FBI, tasked with investigating potential corruption or abuse of power, was aware of, involved in, or sidelined from these decisions. When all these threads are woven together, the composite picture that emerges is of a federal law enforcement agency operating under extraordinary internal and external strain. It is an agency whose current director is viewed by critics, including the Congresswoman who confronted him directly, as lacking the traditional qualifications for the role. It is an agency that appears to be reallocating finite resources away from the violent and extremist threats that have claimed American lives in churches, schools, and neighborhoods. It is an agency whose own personnel describe collapsing morale and a sense that the institution is becoming unrecognizable. And it is now an agency whose leadership finds itself at the center of a congressional inquiry that includes a formal demand for records tied to one of the most high-profile and disturbing criminal cases in recent memory. The hearing placed into the permanent record documented intelligence on foreign efforts to fracture American democracy through disinformation and hacking. It highlighted the statistical reality of domestic extremism that continues to metastasize. It brought forward accounts of Republican lawmakers and their families living in fear, sleeping with firearms for protection after threats linked to routine legislative votes. And it featured a congresswoman who dispensed with the polished euphemisms that often cloak such proceedings. She looked the director in the eye and articulated what millions of Americans across the political spectrum have been sensing in their bones. The current leadership has not delivered the sense of security or institutional reliability the public has every right to expect. The numbers, the internal letters, the operational timelines, and the pattern of threats do not lie. This leaves the country at a critical juncture. The subpoena motion, if enforced, could open an entirely new avenue of scrutiny into how justice is administered at the highest levels, whether favoritism exists, whether policies are applied uniformly, and whether the public's trust in the system remains intact. Whether the committee follows through with vigor, whether the Bureau of Prisons and the Department of Justice comply fully and transparently, whether the broader public chooses to pay sustained attention rather than allowing the story to fade into the background, all of these factors will determine the next chapter. The story is far from concluded. In many respects, it has only just begun to unfold in earnest. If you have stayed with this detailed reconstruction this far, you have engaged with a level of depth and context that most mainstream outlets have not provided. You have encountered the specific allegations, the evidence formally introduced into the record, the internal warnings from FBI personnel, and the procedural motion that could unlock further revelations. What happens next is not abstract. It will shape public confidence in federal law enforcement for years to come. This channel remains committed to following every development. When the subpoena is acted upon or resisted, when the FBI offers its formal response, when additional documents or testimony surface, when the implications for domestic security and equal justice become clearer. We will continue the work of digging beneath the surface because the full picture matters more than any single sound bite or partisan spin. If you believe this kind of sustained, evidence-driven examination is worth preserving and amplifying, then sharing this piece with even one person who distrusts the conventional narrative can have an outsized impact. Word-of-mouth transmission still carries more credibility than algorithmic promotion. Drop your reflections in the comments. Which element of the hearing resonated most powerfully with you? Which unanswered questions would you like explored in greater detail? Which aspects of institutional reform seem most urgent? Your input helps shape what comes next. And if you want to ensure you never miss the subsequent installments, when the subpoena battle plays out, when new evidence emerges, when the broader consequences for American safety crystallize, then subscribing is the simplest way to stay connected. You will not be inundated with daily filler or click-driven noise. You will receive thoughtful analysis only when there is genuinely substantive material worth your finite time and attention. Subscribe tonight or return whenever the next significant development breaks. The choice is yours. Either way, the work of monitoring, contextualizing, and presenting these stories without compromise will continue. Until the next chapter unfolds, remain engaged, maintain healthy skepticism toward all official narratives, and refuse to accept that the complete story is something you are not entitled to know in full. The institutions belong to the people, and the people retain the right, and the responsibility, to demand they function as intended. The hearing room exchange we have just reconstructed was one small but powerful assertion of that right. Its reverberations are only beginning.